The clock on the wall of the Windermere station booking hall, a solemn and authoritative regulator of local life, had a particularly deliberate tick. It was a sound that suggested not the frantic passing of seconds, but the stately procession of minutes. At 4:15 in the afternoon, this procession was nearing a moment of minor civic importance, the scheduled departure of the 4:17 local service to Oxenholme, a train of no great distinction but of immense value to the half-dozen or so souls who relied upon it. On platform 2, Miss Agatha Trimble stood with her back so straight it seemed to defy the very concept of vertebrae. She was a retired headmistress whose posture still commanded an invisible assembly hall of unruly children. Her sensible shoes were planted precisely 1 foot from the platform's edge, a distance she had calculated decades ago as the optimal balance between proximity and prudence. She had a ticket to Staveley, where she was to take tea with her sister, and the 4:17 was the linchpin of the entire engagement. A little further down the platform, Major Eustace Blenkinsop paced. He moved in short, sharp bursts, pivoting on his heel as if executing a parade ground maneuver. His moustache, a magnificent silver affair, bristled with an impatience that was his default state when dealing with public services. The Major did not view timetables as suggestions, but as solemn contracts between the citizen and the Crown, represented in this instance by British Rail. The station itself dozed in the watery September sunlight. A porter languidly swept a platform that was already immaculate. From the buffet, the scent of strong tea and toasted tea cakes drifted, a comforting aroma of continuity. The only figure of true authority present was the station master, Mr. Cecil Sowerbutt, who at that moment emerged from his office. He was a man compressed into his uniform, a study in starched collars and polished brass buttons. His expression was one of permanent, mild disapproval, as if the world were a sloppily written report he was eternally condemned to read. The station clock ticked. Its large hand clicked past the 3, then the 4. 4:17 arrived, and then, with a quiet impertinence, it passed. Nothing happened. No rumble was heard down the line. No whistle pierced the calm. The signal remained stubbornly, neutrally upright. Miss Trimble's gloved hands tightened on her handbag. The Major stopped his pacing and glared down the empty track as if hoping to intimidate the train into existence. At 4:19, the Major's patience, a notoriously finite resource, evaporated entirely. He marched towards Mr. Sowerbutt, who was observing the distant fells with the detached air of a man contemplating eternity. "I say, Sowerbutts!" the Major barked, his voice accustomed to carrying across wind-swept plains. "Is the 4:17 experiencing some sort of technical difficulty?" Mr. Sowerbutt turned his head slowly, his gaze travelling from the horizon to the Major's agitated face. He blinked once. "The 4:17, Major?" he inquired, his tone suggesting the Major had asked after a mythical beast. "Yes, the 4:17. To Oxenholme. It is now 3 minutes late." Mr. Sowerbutt afforded himself a small, thin smile. It was not a smile of humour, but of superior knowledge. "I'm afraid there must be some misunderstanding, Major. There is no 4:17 service on a Friday." The Major's face, already florid, deepened to a shade of plum. "No 4:17? Of course there's a 4:17. I've been catching the Friday 4:17 for the past 15 years. Miss Trimble, drawn by the exchange, glided towards them. "The Major is quite correct, Mr. Sowerbutt," she chimed in, her voice crisp and clear. "The winter timetable explicitly lists it. Page 12, column B." Mr. Sowerbutts's expression did not alter. He was a cliff against which the waves of public opinion crashed in vain. "The public timetable, as you call it, is a guide," he stated calmly. "The operational schedule is the fact, and the fact is no 4:17 p.m. service to Oxenholme was rostered for today." He seemed to take a quiet satisfaction in the word rostered, as if its deployment was a final, unanswerable move in a game of chess. But But that's preposterous, sputtered the Major. It's on the main board. In the booking hall. An administrative oversight, I assure you. An unfortunate error that has yet to be rectified, said Sowerbutt. He gave a slight nod, as if to close the matter, and made to turn away. One moment, said Miss Trimble, her voice taking on the steely edge that had once made sixth-form boys tremble. Are you suggesting, Mr. Sowerbutt, that both the Major and I have simultaneously taken leave of our senses, that this train, which is a cornerstone of our respective weekly schedules, is a shared delusion? The station master looked from one to the other. There was not a flicker of doubt in his eyes, only the serene confidence of a man in possession of a truth so absolute it required no defending. I am suggesting nothing of the sort. Madam, he said, his politeness a weapon in itself. I am merely stating the operational reality. There is no train. There was never going to be a train. I am sorry for your inconvenience. He retreated into the sanctuary of his office, closing the door with a gentle but definitive click. On the platform, Miss Trimble and Major Blenkinsop were left staring at the empty track, their shared sense of reality profoundly shaken. The 4:17 to Oxenholme had not been cancelled, nor was it late. According to the only man who mattered, it had quite simply never existed at all. Information, in a town the size of Windermere, behaves less like a flowing river and more like a contagion. It requires a host, and the most effective host for the curious affliction of the 4:17 was Vera Pickles, the presiding genius of the station buffet. It was to her steamy sanctuary that Miss Trimble and Major Blenkinsop retreated, united by shock and a sudden pressing need for restorative tea. Vera, a woman whose placid exterior concealed the sharpest intelligence network in the district, saw them enter and knew at once that the day's equilibrium had been disturbed. She dispensed 2 cups of tea with the practiced sympathy of a field nurse. "You've missed your train, have you, love?" she said to Miss Trimble, her voice a comforting balm. "Missed it?" the Major boomed, rattling the sugar bowl. "The man Sowerbutt denies it exists. Stood there and told us to our faces that we'd imagined it." Vera's hands, which were polishing a glass, stilled. Her interest, already piqued, became laser-focused. "He said what, Major?" And so the story was told. It was a good story to begin with, a satisfying tale of officialdom gone mad. But in the warm, gossip-friendly atmosphere of the buffet, it began to bloom. By the time Vera relayed the basics to Mr. Ashworth, who was collecting his daily meat pie, the narrative had acquired a subtle gloss. Sowerbutt hadn't just denied the train, he had been peculiar and glassy-eyed. Mr. Ashworth, in turn, mentioned this to his wife over dinner, by which time glassy-eyed had matured into clearly not himself. Mrs. Ashworth, phoning her sister to discuss a WI jam-making rota, felt it her duty to report that poor Mr. Sowerbutt at the station had suffered some sort of breakdown and was now cancelling trains at will. The story reached its most baroque form in the queue at Dawson's Butcher's the following morning. The official version, circulating among those waiting for sausages, was that a whole train, engine and carriages, had pulled into a siding and then simply vanished into thin air, and that Sowerbutt was desperately trying to cover it up. Possibly at the behest of shadowy figures from London, it was this lurid account that fell upon the ears of Councillor Horace Grout. Councillor Grout was a man for whom the smooth running of Windermere was not merely a civic duty, but a reflection of his own personal merit. An unexpected pothole was a slight. A chaotic public service was a declaration of war. "Vanished?" he exclaimed, causing Mrs. Higgins from Rose Cottage to drop a pound of mince. "What in blazes do you mean, vanished?" He listened, his face growing darker with every embellished detail. He did not, of course, believe the more fantastic elements, but he understood the core threat. Public confidence was being eroded. The town was becoming a laughingstock. It was a failure of process, of order, of decency. It was, in short, a matter for the authorities. Striding from the butcher's shop, leaving his weekend sausages forgotten on the counter, he made directly for a public telephone box at the Windermere police station The Saturday morning shift was proceeding with its customary tranquility. Sergeant Sidney Love was painstakingly filling out a report on a series of stolen ornamental fish. He was a solid, literal man who believed the world was an orderly place, provided people filled in the correct forms. The telephone rang, its shrill cry an unwelcome intrusion. Sergeant Love listened for several minutes, his expression slowly transforming from dutiful concentration to utter bewilderment. He held the receiver a few inches from his ear, as if Councillor Grout's indignation might be physically transmitted through the device. He made notes. The notes grew increasingly surreal. He put the receiver down and walked into the office of Inspector Purbright. Purbright was examining a wilting pot plant on his windowsill, seemingly absorbed in its slow, dignified decline. He looked up, his calm grey eyes showing mild inquiry. "That was Councillor Grout, sir," Sergeant Love began, consulting his notepad as if it contained instructions from another world. "There appears to have been an incident at the railway station." "Indeed?" Purbright said, his tone inviting elaboration but not demanding it. "Yes, sir." "It's a bit confused." "According to the councillor, a significant number of the public have been left stranded. A public conveyance has been misappropriated or has otherwise ceased to be, and the station master, a Mr. Sowerbutts, is engaged in what Councillor Grout terms a campaign of bureaucratic mendacity." Purbright considered this. "A campaign of bureaucratic mendacity," he repeated softly, savouring the phrase. "The councillor has a gift for language. But what precisely is the complaint, Sidney?" Sergeant Love took a deep breath. "The complaint, sir, as far as I can distill it from the outrage, is that yesterday's 4:17 train to Oxenholme failed to arrive because Mr. Sowerbutts insists that it doesn't exist, whereas several members of the public, including Major Blenkinsop, insist that it does." Inspector Purbright turned his gaze from the pot plant to his sergeant. For a moment he said nothing. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. He looked less like a police officer faced with a crime and more like a naturalist who has just been informed of a new and fascinatingly peculiar species. "So we are being asked," Purbright said, his voice laced with a delicate irony, "to investigate the non-existence of a train." "And the mendacity, sir?" "Don't forget the mendacity." "Of course," Purbright murmured, rising slowly from his chair. "One can't have mendacity going unchecked. It's bad for the civic character. I think perhaps we should take a walk down to the station, Sidney. It sounds as though the timetable is in need of police protection." The walk to the railway station was short and conducted in a silence broken only by the chirping of sparrows. Sergeant Love, a man who liked his facts to be as solid and dependable as paving stones, was wrestling with the sheer formlessness of the complaint. How did one arrest a concept? How did you take witness statements on the memory of a train? Inspector Purbright, by contrast, seemed entirely untroubled. He ambled along with the air of a man heading to a garden fete, his gaze taking in the neat front gardens and the orderly procession of milk bottles on doorsteps. He understood that the disturbance was not to the railway network, but to the delicate, invisible web of habit and expectation that held a town like Windermere together. A tear in that fabric was always more interesting than a simple case of breaking and entering. They found Mr. Sowerbutts in his office, a small glass-walled room that allowed him to survey his domain like a captain on his bridge. He was seated at a large oak desk, making an entry in a leather-bound ledger with a fountain pen. The entire scene was one of meticulous, unshakable order. He looked up as the two police officers entered, his expression showing no surprise, only a mild, weary resignation that the forces of chaos had finally seen fit to send emissaries. "Inspector Purbright," he said, not rising, "I had been led to expect you." "Councillor Grout is a man of prompt action," Purbright replied, his tone pleasantly neutral. He gestured to the ledger. "I hope we are not interrupting important work." "The 10:52 departure summary," Sowerbutts said, It was logged 2 minutes late due to a delay in baggage handling. Every detail must be recorded. Accuracy is the foundation of a reliable service. He capped his pen with a precise click, the sound echoing the finality of his world view. Quite, Purbright murmured. It is in a way a question of accuracy that brings us here. Mr. Sowerbutts, the matter of yesterday's 4:17 service. Sergeant Love produced his notebook, a gesture that seemed to have no effect whatsoever on the station master. Sowerbutts leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in protest. There is no matter, Inspector, as I explained to the two passengers. Yesterday there was no 4:17 service. An error on the public-facing literature. I grant you, unfortunate. But the operational reality was, and is, quite clear. And this operational reality, Purbright prompted gently, is recorded where? With an air of quiet triumph, Sowerbutts slid the heavy ledger across his desk. The daily operations log, Inspector. The station's Bible. You will find every scheduled service for yesterday, from the 6:05 milk train to the 22:40 mail express. You will not find a 4:17 to Oxenholme. It is not there because it was not scheduled to run. Purbright spent a few moments examining the page. The handwriting was a model of clerical perfection, each letter formed with rigid consistency. It was a document that radiated authority. He looked from the book to the man who had written it. They seemed to be extensions of one another. And this public-facing literature, Purbright continued, his voice still casual. The main timetable in the hall. When was that last updated? That is a matter for head office, Sowerbutts said with a slight shrug. My domain is the running of this station according to the instructions I am given. My instructions are in this book. This book is my reality. I cannot be held responsible for the realities of others. This statement, so perfectly and calmly delivered, hung in the air. Sergeant Love shifted his weight, clearly struggling with the philosophical turn the conversation had taken. Purbright, however, simply nodded, as if Sowerbutts had just explained a complex but entirely logical point of law. Thank you for your time, Mr. Sowerbutts. You have been most clear. Outside, back in the mild sunshine, Love exhaled. Clear as mud, sir. He's built himself a paper fortress and pulled up the drawbridge. You can't argue with a book. No, Sydney, Purbright agreed. But you can consult other libraries. Their next call was to the neat, lavender-flanked cottage of Miss Agatha Trimble. She received them in a sitting room so tidy it felt less lived in and more curated. She had calmed since the previous day, her agitation replaced by the cold, hard anger of a woman whose meticulously structured world had been assaulted. It is a matter of principle. Inspector, she stated, pouring them tea from a silver pot. For 42 years I was a headmistress. My life was governed by the bell. 9 a.m. assembly, 11:15 break time, 3:45 home time. I understand the sanctity of a schedule. That man has violated it. You are quite certain about the train? Purbright asked, accepting a cup. As certain as I am that the sun rises in the east, she said, her voice firm. Every second Friday for the last 7 years, I have taken the 4:17 to visit my sister in Staveley. It is entered in my diary. Would you care to see my diary? That won't be necessary, Miss Trimble. I believe you. Mr. Sowerbutts does not, she said, a flash of hurt in her eyes. He looked at me as if I were a confused child making up stories. Their final visit was to the residence of Major Blenkinsop, a dark, imposing house filled with sporting trophies and the faint scent of Brasso. The Major was in his study wearing a tweed jacket that appeared to be locked in a permanent battle with his formidable torso. About time, he roared, foregoing any other greeting. Have you arrested the fellow? Our inquiries are at an early stage, Major, Purbright said calmly. Early stage? Good heavens, man, what is there to inquire about? The man is a public servant who is failing to serve the public. He's either incompetent or a Bolshevik, and I'm not sure which is worse. It's a breakdown of discipline, Inspector. That's the problem with this country. No one follows orders anymore. The timetable is an order. He has disobeyed the timetable. The Major's account of the event was identical to Miss Trimble's, but where hers was a tale of violated principle, his was one of outright insubordination. He paced the threadbare Persian rug as he spoke, his hands clasped behind his back, occasionally stopping to glare at a mounted stag's head as if it were the delinquent station master himself. Leaving the Major's house, Sergeant Love flipped his notebook shut with a sigh of profound exasperation. "So," he said, as they walked back towards the town centre, "we have a man whose reality is written in a book, a woman whose reality is written in her diary, and a major whose reality is carved in stone. They all contradict each other, and they're all absolutely convinced they're right." Purbright nodded, looking up at the solid, dependable stone of the parish church tower. "Yes," he said, a thoughtful expression on his face. "It's not a crime of action we have here, Sydney. It's a crime of certainty, and that is a much more difficult thing to unravel." By Monday morning, the case of the non-existent train had ascended from the realm of public gossip to the rarefied atmosphere of official concern. Inspector Purbright was summoned to the office of the Chief Constable, Captain Harcourt. It was a room that reflected its occupant. Everything was polished, positioned at right angles, and gave the impression of having been recently inspected by a higher authority. Seated opposite the Chief Constable, looking entirely at home in a chair that made lesser men feel like errant schoolboys, was Councillor Horace Grout, Captain Harcourt, a man whose military background had instilled in him a deep love of clarity and a profound suspicion of nuance, came directly to the point. He had Purbright's preliminary notes on his desk, and he tapped them with a well-manicured finger. "Purbright," he began, his voice crisp, "this sour-butts business. I've had a lengthy discussion with Councillor Grout. We've reviewed the facts. It seems quite straightforward." Councillor Grout nodded sagely, a look of grave civic responsibility on his face. "A most distressing lapse in public service. The Council takes a very dim view of it." "A very dim view indeed," Harcourt continued, laying out the case like a campaign map. "On the one hand, we have the official published timetable of British Rail, a document available to the public. On the other, we have the sworn testimony of at least 2 reputable citizens, a decorated military man and a respected former educator. Both confirm the long-standing existence of this 417 service." He paused for effect. "Against all of that, we have one man, a station master, who, when confronted with a simple scheduling query, elects to invent a fantasy world in which the train does not exist, basing his entire argument on a private logbook of his own keeping. He has barricaded himself behind a wall of his own regulations," Grout interjected, clearly pleased with the metaphor. "It's an affront to the public who pay his wages." "The conclusion," the Chief Constable said, leaning forward, "is inescapable. The man has made a significant error. A timetabling change has gone unnoticed, a directive has been misread, something of that nature. Instead of admitting a simple mistake, his pride, or perhaps some more concerning mental fixation, has caused him to double down. He is attempting to bend reality to fit his own error. It is, frankly, the most spectacular display of pig-headed incompetence I've seen in years." Purbright, who had listened to this summary with polite attention, said nothing. He simply looked at the Chief Constable with an expression of mild academic interest. "Well?" Harcourt demanded. "You've spoken to him? You've seen the so-called evidence? You must agree, Mr. Sowerbutts is certainly a man of conviction, sir," Purbright offered. "Conviction?" Grout scoffed. "Obstinacy. The man is a menace. He has made this town a subject of ridicule. I've had people from Staveley asking me if we require passports to use our own railway station now." "The point, Purbright," Harcourt cut in, steering the conversation back to action, "is what we do about it. This isn't really a police matter in the criminal sense. It is an issue of public order and administrative sanity. We will, of course, be filing a formal complaint with the Regional Transport Authority. But, in the meantime, Councillor Grout and I are in agreement that Mr. Sowerbutts cannot be allowed to continue in his role. He must be suspended pending a full investigation by his superiors." This was the official conclusion, delivered with the satisfying thud of a rubber stamp. The problem had been identified, a solution proposed. The file could now be moved from the pending tray to actioned. "My role in this, sir?" Purbright asked quietly. "Your report," Harcourt said. "It will form the basis of our complaint. I want a clear summary. Sowerbutt's dereliction of duty, his refusal to acknowledge the public timetable, the distress caused to passengers. Keep it simple. Stick to the facts. The man made a mistake and is now compounding it with a stubborn and bizarre cover-up. That's the long and short of it." "I see, sir." There was a moment of silence. Purbright's quiet compliance seemed, paradoxically, to unnerve the chief constable more than an argument would have done. Harcourt looked at him, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. He wanted enthusiastic agreement, a firm nod, a hearty, "Just so, sir." He was getting passive acceptance. "Is there something you wish to add, Inspector?" he asked, his tone sharpening. "Only that Mr. Sowerbutt did not strike me as a man prone to fantasy, sir," Purbright said. "His world seems very solid, very factual." "It's simply that his facts do not align with ours," Grout snorted.
"He has his own facts."
"What poppycock?"
"There is one set of facts."
"The train is either on a timetable or it is not." "Quite," said Purbright, without specifying which fact he was agreeing with. He rose from his chair. "I will prepare the report, sir." He gave a slight nod to both men and departed, leaving them to bask in the warmth of their shared certainty.
As he walked down the corridor, Sergeant Love fell into step beside him. "So that's it then, sir?"
"Sowerbutt for the high jump?" Purbright didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be pondering a distant and complex problem. "They have built a very neat box and put Mr. Sowerbutt inside it, Sidney," he said at last. "It's tidy, it's logical, and it answers all their questions. But not all of yours, sir?" Purbright stopped and looked at his sergeant. "They have explained his actions," he said softly, "but they haven't explained his certainty. People don't risk their careers and their reputation for a simple mistake. They do it for a principle. I'm just not sure what his principle is. And until I am, the box will have to remain open." Inspector Purbright did not begin writing his report. The official conclusion, so neat and satisfying to Captain Harcourt, sat in his mind like a piece of furniture in the wrong room. Functional, solid, but jarringly out of place. A crime of certainty, he had called it. And the epicenter of that certainty, the very source of its unshakable gravity, was Mr. Cecil Sowerbutt. To understand the crime, he had to understand the man. And a man like Sowerbutt was not defined by grand gestures, but by the small, repeating patterns of his daily life. He left Sergeant Love to wrestle with the preliminary draft, a task the sergeant undertook with the grim determination of a man trying to nail jelly to a wall. Purbright, meanwhile, decided he was in need of a cup of tea. His wanderings, by some strange and entirely unplanned coincidence, led him back to the railway station. The lunchtime rush was over, and Vera Pickles's buffet was an oasis of calm. The air was thick with the comforting smells of Bisto and strong tea. Vera herself was wiping down the counter, her movements economical and soothing. She looked up as Purbright entered and gave him a knowing smile. "Come to investigate the scene of the crime, Inspector?" she asked, her voice rich with amusement. "I'm not sure there has been a crime, Vera," Purbright said, settling onto a stool. "But there's certainly been a great deal of conversation. Tea, please, strong." "There's been nothing but," she confirmed, fetching a cup and saucer.
"The vanishing train, they're calling it now."
"Sounds like a penny dreadful. Poor Mr. Sowerbutt. Always thought he was wound a bit tight, but I never had him down for a public spectacle." "He strikes you as a man who dislikes spectacles?" Purbright inquired, stirring 2 lumps of sugar into his tea. "Dislikes them?"
"Inspector, he'd run a mile."
"Cecil Sowerbutt lives his life by the clock and the rule book. Everything in its place. Everything just so. He's the most predictable man I've ever met." She paused, placing a plate of biscuits on the counter. "It's why Friday was so peculiar." Purbright took a slow sip of tea. He did not ask what was peculiar. He simply waited. Vera, who appreciated a good listener, continued as she polished a teapot to a high shine. He came in for his morning tea. Same time as always, 11 o'clock on the dot. He's never a minute early or a minute late. A man of routine, Purbright observed. The king of routines, Vera agreed. And it's always the same order. Pot of tea, 2 sugars, and one of my currant scones.
Has been for the 10 years I've been here.
But on Friday, he didn't have the scone. This was delivered with the quiet gravity of a priest revealing a crisis of faith. Purbright looked at the plate of biscuits, then back at Vera. His expression was one of polite interest. A change is as good as a rest, they say. Not for Mr. Sourbutt's it isn't, she said firmly. He stood there, looked at the display for a full minute, and then he said, I'll have a slice of the lemon drizzle, please, Vera. Knocked me sideways.
I can tell you, Purbright selected a rich tea biscuit.
Was the lemon drizzle particularly fine that day? It's always fine, Inspector, I'll have you know, Vera said with a touch of professional pride. But that's not the point. It was a break in the pattern.
A big one.
It's like the Queen deciding she fancies a pint of mild instead of her usual cup of Earl Grey. It's just not done. She leaned forward conspiratorially.
And he looked different too, a bit.
Distracted, fidgety, not his usual self at all. Then a few hours later, all that business with the train kicks off. I said to myself at the time, something's not right with that man today. It was the cake that told me. Purbright finished his tea. He considered the information. It was trivial. It was inconsequential. It was the sort of detail that would have been laughed out of Captain Harcourt's office. A station master changes his morning snack. It was hardly evidence of anything. And yet it was the first thing all week that didn't fit. The witnesses were certain of the train. Sourbutt's was certain of his logbook. Everyone was encased in their own logic. But the lemon drizzle cake belonged to no logic at all. It was an anomaly. A rogue data point in a sea of rigid consistency. Men like Sourbutt did not break the habits of a decade for no reason. Such an action required a catalyst. Was he celebrating a secret triumph? Was he steeling his nerves for a confrontation he knew was coming? Was it a peace offering for someone, bored on the way home? The official conclusion that Sourbutt had made a simple error about the train and was too proud to admit it did not account for a change that had taken place hours earlier. The cake came first. Thank you for the tea, Vera, he said, placing some coins on the counter.
It was most illuminating. Any time, Inspector.
You let me know when you figure out what's what. As he walked out of the station and into the afternoon sun, Purbright pushed the grand puzzle of the vanishing train to the back of his mind. Instead, he focused on a much smaller and far more interesting question. Why would a man who had eaten a scone every day for 10 years suddenly on that particular morning decide to have a piece of cake? A lemon drizzle cake, Purbright reflected in the quiet of his office, was not a motive for a crime. It was, however, a symptom. It was a deviation from a baseline of extreme normality, and a detective, like a doctor, pays the closest attention to deviations. A man like Cecil Sourbutt did not simply alter the habits of a lifetime on a whim. He would need a reason, a pressure point, an emotional catalyst powerful enough to overcome the immense inertia of his own routine. To find that pressure point, Purbright knew he had to look beyond the events of that specific Friday. He tasked Sergeant Love with a delicate and rather vague assignment to assemble a portrait of Mr. Sourbutt's professional life. Love, who would have been happier investigating something with fingerprints, set about his task with a sigh. He made discreet inquiries with railway clerks in Carlisle, he reviewed municipal records, and he spent a tedious hour reading back issues of the local newspaper in the library. He returned to Purbright's office late in the afternoon with a thin file and a look of mild disappointment. His record is, for want of a better word, Sir Boring, Love reported. 30 years of service. Not a single demerit. Commendations for punctuality in 78 and 83. He's married, no children, lives in a semi-detached on Chestnut Avenue. The only flicker of anything approaching a passion I could find is this. He pushed a newspaper clipping across the desk. The article was from the previous year, a small piece with a slightly blurry photograph of two men in railway uniforms shaking hands. The headline read, "Staveley Station scoops top prize again." Purbright read the short text. It detailed the results of the annual best-kept station competition, a source of surprisingly fierce pride among regional railway staff. For the second year running, the coveted plaque had been awarded to Staveley, managed by a beaming Mr. Pringle. Windermere, managed by a noticeably less beaming Mr. Sowerbuts, had been awarded the runner-up certificate. His performance reviews mention it too, Love added. His superior notes his commendable but at times overzealous pursuit of the best-kept station award.
It seems to be his life's ambition, an ambition in which he is repeatedly thwarted by Mr. Pringle of Staveley, Purbright mused, looking at the photograph.
The contrast between the two men's expressions was telling. Mr. Pringle radiated smug satisfaction. Mr. Sowerbuts radiated the constrained fury of a man who has just found a slug in his prize-winning rose. Here, then, was a motive. Not for vanishing a train, perhaps, but for a mind under considerable strain, pride, professional jealousy, the annual agony of being second best. A man obsessed with perfection, with order, with having the tidiest flower beds and the most polished brass, would find such a recurring failure deeply wounding. It was a powerful emotional catalyst. It also, Purbright noted, introduced a new character to the drama, albeit one who was currently off stage, the victorious Mr. Pringle. The investigation had acquired a new dimension. It was no longer just about Mr. Sowerbuts's internal state. It was about his relationships with those around him, and there was one relationship closer to home that Purbright had yet to explore. He found the station signalman, Sidney Higgins, in his box at the end of platform 2. It was a world away from Sowerbuts's office, a place of function over form. The air smelled of hot oil and old tea. A complex web of polished steel levers sprouted from the floor, their handles worn smooth by years of use. Sid Higgins himself seemed worn smooth in much the same way. He was a man of indeterminate middle age, with a weary face and shoulders permanently slumped in an attitude of profound resignation. "Inspector?" he said, his voice flat. He did not seem surprised to see him. "Mr. Higgins?" Purbright began, his tone relaxed. "Just a few routine questions. I'm trying to get a sense of the atmosphere at the station last Friday." "Atmosphere?" Higgins gave a short, humourless laugh. "Same as any other day. He was polishing the brass on the door handles at 9 o'clock. He was weeding the petunias at 10. At 11 he went for his tea. After that I was a bit busy. Had the goods train from Kendal to shunt into the siding, so it all seemed perfectly normal to you?" Higgins looked away, his gaze fixed on the gleaming rails outside. "Normal for him," he amended. "All that fussing about."
You'd think he was getting ready for a royal visit, not the Tuesday morning judging of some stupid competition. The best-kept station award?
Purbright prompted. "Mr. Sowerbuts takes it very seriously, I gather." A flicker of something, resentment perhaps, or contempt, passed across the signalman's face. "He's obsessed. Thinks of nothing else from June to September. We all have to muck in.
Extra cleaning, painting the fences. I'm a signalman, not a gardener, but I'm the one who has to deadhead the roses."
All for his little tin plaque. Here was another emotional current, running unseen beneath the placid surface of the station, the subordinate's quiet simmering grudge. The weariness of a man who felt his own vital work was overlooked in favour of his superior's cosmetic ambitions. "It must create a certain amount of pressure," Purbright suggested. "He puts the pressure on himself," Higgins said with a shrug, "and on the rest of us, snapping at everyone if there's so much as a cigarette butt on the platform. Last Friday was no different. He was wound up like a watch spring as usual. Purbright thanked the signalman for his time and left him to his levers and bells. Walking back along the platform, he felt the case shifting and expanding. What had begun as a simple, bizarre conflict between a man and a timetable was becoming something far more complex. It was a web of petty rivalries, thwarted ambitions and quiet resentments. There was Sowerbutts, the proud perfectionist, pushed to the edge by his obsession with an award. There was the unseen Mr. Pringle, the perennial victor, who stood to gain from any misfortune that befell his rival. And now there was Sid Higgins, the disgruntled employee, a man with the means and opportunity to cause chaos, and a simmering motive of his own. The official conclusion in Harcourt's office had been a simple, straight line, but the reality, Purbright suspected, was a tangled knot of very untidy human feelings. And he had a feeling he had only just begun to pull on the threads. For 2 days, a deceptive calm settled over Windermere station. Mr. Sowerbutts, aware that he was now the subject of an official complaint, seemed to retreat even further into a shell of meticulous procedure. He was observed polishing the station's fire extinguishers, an act of such superfluous diligence that it was spoken of in hushed tones in the buffet. The 4:17 train continued its non-existent journey in the public imagination, but the real trains, the ones listed in Mr. Sowerbutts's sacred ledger, ran with a punctuality that was almost aggressive. The matter, it seemed, was simmering quietly on a back burner. Then on Tuesday afternoon, the burner was turned up to full. A frantic call from the station to the police headquarters reported a complete signal failure, a paralysis of the line, and a situation rapidly descending into chaos. When Purbright and Sergeant Love arrived, they found a scene of contained pandemonium. The London Express was held motionless outside the station, its passengers peering from the windows with expressions of mild grievance. On the platform, a small crowd of would-be travellers stood about helplessly, while Mr. Sowerbutts strode amongst them, issuing sharp, unhelpful commands. His face was pale, his uniform looking for the first time as if it were a size too small for the anxiety contained within it.
Another incident. Another black mark.
The plaque for the best-kept station, he could almost feel it, was drifting further away with every passing minute. The source of the problem, they were told, was Sid Higgins's signal box. Purbright found the signalman standing by his silent levers, looking flustered but resolute. "The main downline signal, Inspector," he said, pointing to a large, green-handled lever, jammed solid, stuck on red.
"I can't shift it."
Nothing for it but to halt all traffic and call the engineers.
"It's protocol." He seemed almost to relish the word, a small piece of Sowerbutts's bureaucratic certainty that he could claim for his own. Mr. Sowerbutts bustled in, his agitation barely contained.
"Jammed? What do you mean, jammed?"
"It was inspected last month."
"Are you telling me you can't operate a simple lever, Higgins?" "I'm telling you it's jammed, Mr. Sowerbutts," Higgins retorted, his weary voice taking on a stubborn edge. "Unless you'd like to have a go yourself, be my guest. But if you put the London Express into a siding full of coal wagons, the paperwork will be on your desk, not mine." This invocation of paperwork, the ultimate weapon in any railway dispute, silenced the station master. He glared at the offending lever as if it had personally betrayed him, then at Higgins, and finally at Purbright, his expression a silent plea for the restoration of order in his crumbling kingdom. Purbright watched the exchange with his usual quiet attentiveness. He was less interested in the mechanics of the lever than in the mechanics of the two men. Sowerbutts frantic and accusatory, Higgins defensive and stubbornly by the book. The incident had thrown their simmering resentment into sharp relief. An hour passed. Tempers on the platform frayed. The official team of engineers finally arrived from Oxenholme in a small, clattering utility vehicle. They were practical men in oily overalls who viewed the entire situation with a professional detachment that bordered on boredom. They disappeared into the workings beneath the signal box, their progress marked by the sound of muffled banging and technical-sounding curses. The lead engineer, a man with a face like a well-worn wrench, eventually emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. He approached Mr. Sowerbutts. "Well?" the station master demanded. "What is it?"
"A frayed cable? A worn relay?"
He seemed to hope for a complex, blameless mechanical fault. The engineer shook his head slowly.
Can't find a thing wrong with it, Mr. Sourbuts. What?
But Higgins said it was jammed. I'm sure he did, the engineer said, his tone suggesting he had heard similar stories 1,000 times. But it's not jammed now. We've tested the linkage, checked the circuits, had a look at the lever mechanism itself. It's as smooth as butter.
Must have just been a bit of grit in the housing.
Probably worked itself loose. He gave a shrug that dismissed the entire hour of chaos as a triviality not worth dwelling on. The verdict fell into a pool of stunned silence. Higgins, who had been listening from the doorway of his box, stepped forward.
It was stuck, he insisted, his voice rising.
I'm not an idiot.
I put my whole weight on it.
It wouldn't budge an inch. Sourbuts turned on him, his face a mask of cold fury.
A bit of grit, he hissed, his voice trembling with rage.
You've halted the main line, delayed 100 passengers, and made this station a laughing stock from here to Carlisle because of a bit of grit. As the two men faced each other, the engineers packed their tools, and the station slowly returned to life. The great signal arm outside the station moved with a satisfying clunk, showing a green light. The express train gave a weary sigh and began to pull away. The crisis was over, but a new, more poisonous atmosphere remained. On the walk back to the station, Sergeant Love was decisive.
It was Higgins, sir. Has to be.
He's got a grudge against Sourbuts. He faked that signal failure just to cause trouble and make his boss look incompetent. It all fits. Purbright looked back at the station, now resuming its placid routine. It does fit, Sydney, he conceded. It fits very neatly, which is precisely what troubles me about it. It happened just after I spoke to him. It directs all suspicion his way.
It's a very loud, very dramatic event, isn't it?
Well, yes, sir. That's the point, perhaps, Purbright said softly. But the problem of the 417 was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet. It was a matter of ink and paper and stubbornness.
This feels different.
Like a conjurer waving his right hand about to distract you from what his left hand is doing. The question is, whose hand is it? Inspector Purbright sat in his office long after Sergeant Love had departed for the evening, convinced that he had the measure of Sid Higgins. The station file lay on the desk, a slim collection of statements and observations that managed to explain everything and nothing at all. Purbright had learned long ago that the most baffling cases were rarely solved by the accumulation of new facts, but by the quiet contemplation of the old ones. He leaned back, the leather of his chair groaning a soft complaint. The entire affair, he thought, was an exercise in disproportion. A minor discrepancy in a railway timetable had spiraled into a municipal crisis involving accusations of madness, sabotage, and what Councillor Grout darkly referred to as a complete collapse of public trust. It was a ludicrously large reaction to a vanishingly small problem. And yet people were not ludicrous. They were merely human, and their reactions were governed by a private and often invisible emotional economy. The currency of this economy was not money but pride. Purbright had seen more trouble caused by a wounded ego than by an empty wallet. He considered the world of Mr. Cecil Sourbuts. It was a small kingdom bounded by the station's perimeter fence. Within that kingdom he was an absolute monarch. His word, codified in his leather-bound ledger, was law. His enemy was not crime but chaos, a late departure, a scuffed floor, an unweeded petunia bed, and into this meticulously ordered world came the annual judgment of the Best-Kept Station Award. To an outsider, it was a triviality, a bit of corporate morale boosting. But to Sourbuts, it was clearly the ultimate validation of his life's work. To be beaten year after year by Mr. Pringle of Staveley must have been an agony. It wasn't just a loss. It was a public declaration that his kingdom was inferior, his rule flawed. This, Purbright mused, was the engine of the whole affair. The immense grinding pressure of one man's ambition to have the tidiest station on the furnace line. This pressure explained the man, but it did not explain the events. If Sourbuts had simply made a mistake under stress, he might have been expected to bluster or cover it up. But to deny the train's very existence with such serene, unshakable certainty, that was something else. It was not the act of a man hiding a mistake. It was the act of a man defending a fundamental truth. And then there was the cake. Purbright smiled faintly. Captain Harcourt would have dismissed it as irrelevant gossip. But the lemon drizzle cake was the one item that refused to fit the simple narrative of a proud man cracking under pressure. The cake had been purchased on the Friday morning, hours before the confrontation on the platform. It was an anomaly that preceded the crisis. It was a deliberate break with a decade of tradition. It was a choice. Why? A man on the verge of a breakdown or a man trying to cover up an error does not calmly alter his morning pastry selection. He drinks his tea too quickly, his mind elsewhere. The cake suggested a different emotional state altogether. Forethought, preparation, perhaps even a small, private celebration. And into this delicate psychological stew, the signal failure had been thrown like a brick. Purbright considered his own metaphor of the conjurer. The signal failure was a spectacular piece of misdirection. It created noise, chaos, and most importantly, a suspect. Sid Higgins, with his weary resentment and his convenient proximity to the levers of power, was now the focus of everyone's attention. It was too perfect. It was the solution everyone, from Sergeant Love to Mr. Sowerbutts himself, would want to believe. It exonerated Sowerbutts, explaining the recent troubles as the work of a disgruntled subordinate, and it gave the police a simple, prosecutable villain. Purbright steepled his fingers, his gaze distant. He saw the threads now not as a tangled mess, but as a coherent, if eccentric, pattern. The obsessive pride of the station master, the simmering resentment of the signalman, the public certainty of the passengers, and the quiet, inexplicable choice of a piece of cake over a scone. These were not separate incidents. They were all part of the same quiet, desperate human drama. The crime here was not the disruption of the railway. That was merely the stage. The crime, as it so often was, had been committed against a person's reputation. He was not yet sure who had done what, but he was beginning to understand the strange and powerful forces at play. This was not a case about timetables or faulty signals. It was a case about the lengths a man would go to protect his own small corner of the world and the quiet, devastating weapons they used in those invisible wars. He had enough, he thought, to pose a question. And a well-posed question, he had always found, was often more effective than a pair of handcuffs. The following morning, Inspector Purbright decided that the time for quiet contemplation was over. It was time to arrange a meeting. His chosen venue was the station master's office, the small glass-walled box from which Mr. Sowerbutts surveyed his kingdom. His chosen attendees were Mr. Sowerbutts himself, the signalman Sid Higgins, and, as a crucial representative of civic order and outrage, Councillor Horace Grout. He informed them that the meeting was merely a final procedural step, a chance to clarify any outstanding details before he submitted his official report to the Chief Constable. They gathered at 11 o'clock, a time chosen by Purbright for its mundane neutrality. The atmosphere in the small office was thick with unspoken resentments. Mr. Sowerbutts sat enthroned behind his large oak desk, the very picture of beleaguered authority. Sid Higgins, summoned from his signal box, perched awkwardly on a small wooden chair near the door, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on a patch of worn linoleum. Councillor Grout, radiating impatience, took the only other chair and immediately began tapping his foot, a rhythmic expression of his belief that the entire affair ought to have been resolved days ago. Purbright, appearing entirely at ease, stood near the window, looking out at the platform as if admiring the architecture. Sergeant Love stood impassively by his side, notebook at the ready. "Gentlemen," Purbright began, turning from the window, "thank you for coming.
I won't keep you long, as you know my report on the recent
disruptions is due. I want to ensure it is as accurate and comprehensive as possible." Councillor Grout cleared his throat. "Comprehensive? Seems perfectly simple to me, Inspector. A train failed to appear. A signal failed to work. The station is being run incompetently. That's all the report needs to say. Suspend the man and have done with it. He threw a challenging glare at Sowerbutts, who stiffened but did not reply. Purbright gave a mild, placating smile. Official reports must explore all avenues, Councillor. One has to consider the entire context. The general atmosphere and pressures of a working environment, for instance. He paused, letting the silence hang for a moment. He then turned his calm gaze towards the station master. This best-kept station award, Mr. Sowerbutts. I understand it is a matter of considerable importance to you and your staff. Sowerbutts, who had been expecting an attack, seemed momentarily wrong-footed by the change of subject. We take pride in our station, Inspector, he said stiffly. It is a matter of professional duty. Higgins shifted on his chair, his expression unreadable. Grout looked utterly baffled. The station award? Good grief, man, what has that got to do with anything? It creates a competitive environment, Purbright continued, his voice still pleasantly conversational. And in any competition, people are keen to gain an advantage. Which brings me to a small secondary matter that has been brought to our attention. I'm sure it's nothing, but we are obliged to follow it up. He let his gaze drift from Sowerbutts to Higgins and back again. We received an anonymous tip-off. A rather malicious piece of gossip, in all likelihood. It was suggested to us that the judging for the award has been compromised in the past. Specifically that a station in this region may have improved its chances by falsifying certain maintenance and cleanliness records to gain an unfair advantage over its
rivals. The effect of this statement on the
room's 3 occupants was immediate and profound. Councillor, Grout threw his hands up in exasperation. Falsified records? Inspector, are we here to discuss railway safety or the polishing of benches?
This is an absurd tangent.
His reaction was pure, unadulterated annoyance. He was the control subject. The innocent bystander, Mr. Sowerbutts, however, had the opposite reaction. His stiffness vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense alertness. He leaned forward over his desk, his eyes alight with a fierce, vindicated gleam. Here was an idea that resonated with his deepest sense of injustice. The possibility that his rival, the smug Mr. Pringle of Staveley, was not just better, but a cheat. Falsified records? He repeated, his voice sharp with interest. Did this tip-off happen to mention which station, Inspector? Purbright's gaze, however, had settled on Sid Higgins. The signalman had not moved. He had not leaned forward, nor had he thrown his hands up.
He had frozen.
The weary resignation in his posture had been replaced by a wire-taut stillness. His eyes, which had been fixed on the floor, were now wide, staring at Purbright with an expression of raw panic, like a small animal caught in the beam of a torch. He looked down at his hands, then back up, his mouth slightly agape. While Sowerbutts saw the accusation as a weapon he could use against his rival, Higgins heard it as something else entirely, a secret he thought was known to him alone, now inexplicably being spoken aloud in a police inspector's voice. The moment lasted only a few seconds. Purbright had seen all he needed to see. He gave a small, dismissive wave of his hand. As I said, almost certainly malicious gossip from a disgruntled source. But you see the sort of thing we must deal with. I don't believe we need to pursue it further. He turned to Grout. Thank you for your input, Councillor. Mr. Sowerbutts, Mr. Higgins, your time has been most valuable. He had concluded the meeting.
Councillor Grout left, muttering about time-wasters.
Sowerbutts remained behind his desk, a thoughtful, calculating look on his face, his mind clearly miles away in Staveley. Sid Higgins mumbled his goodbyes and practically fled from the room. Purbright and Sergeant Love walked out onto the platform. The noon train to Carlisle was pulling in, and the station was functioning with perfect, unblemished normality. I didn't understand a word of that, sir, Love confessed. What did falsified records have to do with anything? Purbright watched Sid Higgins hurry back towards the lonely sanctuary of his signal box. It had nothing to do with the official story, Sidney, he said quietly. but it had everything to do with the truth. He paused, a faint, ironic smile touching his lips. And I think we now know beyond any reasonable doubt what the lemon drizzle cake was for. Inspector Purbright did not go back to his office. Instead, he sent a bewildered Sergeant Love on an errand to the town hall archives and walked, quite deliberately, back to the signal box. He found Sid Higgins inside, methodically polishing a brass lever handle with an oily rag. The signalman did not seem to be expecting another visit, but when he saw the inspector in his doorway, a look of profound and weary defeat settled upon his face. He stopped his polishing and waited. "It is a complicated mechanism, a signal box," Purbright began, his voice calm and conversational as he stepped inside. "So many moving parts, so many ways for a small, unnoticed error to cause a great deal of trouble." Higgins said nothing. He merely looked at the inspector. "For days," Purbright continued, "we have all been looking at the wrong crime. We've been looking for a madman or a saboteur. But this was never about madness or brute force. It was a quiet, clever little crime. A crime of paper and ink born out of frustration. Your frustration, Mr. Higgins?" He let the accusation hang in the oily air. Higgins's shoulders, already slumped, seemed to sink another inch. "It was the best-kept station award, of course," Purbright said, as if discussing the weather.
The source of all the pressure.
"It made Mr. Sourbutt's obsessed, and it made you resentful. All that extra work, the weeding and the window cleaning, for his glory, not yours. You felt overlooked.
And in the course of your duties you noticed something, didn't you?
You noticed that in his desperation to finally beat Mr. Pringle, Mr. Sourbutt was cutting a few corners, falsifying the cleaning rota, perhaps.
Exaggerating the frequency of the platforms sweeping in the logs.
Small, petty cheats, but cheats nonetheless.
You knew his secret. Purbright paused, watching the slow crumbling of the signalman's composure. You could have reported him.
But that would have been messy. An official inquiry. Your word against his. You wanted a different kind of revenge. You wanted to puncture his pride, to make him look like a fool in the very domain where he felt supreme, his perfect, orderly station. You wanted to attack his competence. So you devised a simple, elegant plan. You knew that every morning the daily running schedule is posted for the station staff. And you knew that Mr. Sourbutt, a man of immense but uncreative diligence, simply copies that schedule into his grand leather ledger, which then becomes his Bible for the day. You saw your chance. On that Friday morning, you made one tiny alteration to that daily schedule before he saw it. You simply erased the 4:17 local service to Oxenholme. Higgins flinched. A small, involuntary jerk. It was a brilliant psychological gamble, Purbright went on, his voice holding a note of detached admiration. You gambled everything on Mr. Sourbutt's character. You knew he was so utterly reliant on his own paperwork, so blinded by his belief in his own meticulousness, that he would never think to doubt it. You knew that if his sacred ledger said there was no train, he would be constitutionally incapable of believing the evidence of the public timetable, the passengers, or his own common sense. You turned his greatest strength, his rigid adherence to the rules, into his fatal weakness. And he performed exactly as you predicted. He stood on his platform and with perfect sincerity denied reality. The inspector gestured vaguely towards the station buffet. "And the cake, Mr. Higgins, that little anomaly that didn't seem to fit. It was you who told me Mr. Sourbutt was wound up like a watch spring. He was. Not about the train, but about his own petty cheating for the award. My guess is he'd had a row with his wife about his obsession, about the long hours spent polishing brass instead of being at home. The lemon drizzle cake wasn't for him. It was a peace offering for her."
A domestic apology. A symptom of the pressure you were so cleverly exploiting. Finally, Higgins spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper.
"The signal. Ah, yes, the signal," Purbright said.
"That was your mistake. My visit unnerved you. You thought I was getting too close."
"So you panicked. You staged a second crime, a loud, clumsy, obvious one.
A jammed lever.
You created a situation where you, the disgruntled subordinate, became the prime suspect for an act of crude sabotage. You hoped we would arrest you for that, for the crime you didn't commit, and in doing so we would entirely miss the subtle, clever crime you actually did. It was a desperate, and I must say, rather ill-conceived red herring. A long silence filled the signal box, broken only by the gentle hum of the relays. Sid Higgins stared at his hands, calloused from years of pulling levers.
All the fight had gone out of him. He never even checked, he said at last, his voice hollow.
Just saw it wasn't on the sheet and copied it out. Never once thought to look at the main board. Too proud. He looked up at Purbright, his eyes filled not with malice, but with a deep, abiding sadness. All that fuss.
All that polishing. And he doesn't even know how to run a station.
He just knows how to write things in a book. It was, Purbright reflected, the perfect summary of the entire affair. He looked around the signal box at this small, isolated world of immense responsibility and no glamour. It was a quiet, lonely job. A job that gave a man a great deal of time to think and to let small resentments fester into elaborate, carefully planned acts of revenge. The railway authorities will have to be informed, of course, Purbright said quietly. What they decide to do is a matter for them. He did not need to say any more. There would be no handcuffs, no dramatic arrest. The truth, laid bare in the quiet of the signal box, was punishment enough. There was no trial, nor any grand inquiry. Inspector Purbright had a quiet, 20-minute conversation with a very discreet man from the Regional Railway Authority, a man whose entire career appeared to have been dedicated to making problems disappear with the minimum of fuss. The language used was one of administrative nuance, speaking of personnel reassignment and procedural reviews, rather than revenge and wounded pride. A week later, Sid Higgins vanished from his signal box. He was not dismissed.
That would have invited questions.
He was transferred, the official reason being a staffing shortage on a remote, single-track line deep in the Pennines. A quiet, windswept post where the only company was the sheep and the only timetable worth noting was the slow procession of the seasons. It was a form of exile so subtle that it was barely a punishment at all, merely a removal from the board of a player who had overstepped the rules of the game. Mr. Sourbuts remained. He kept his office, his uniform, and his title. But something had changed. The ramrod stiffness in his spine seemed to have lessened, and the crisp certainty in his voice was often replaced by a slight hesitation. The great machinery of his pride had been publicly dismantled, and he was left humbled by the knowledge that his entire world of rules had been turned against him by a simple, malicious piece of paper. The station's flower beds, it was noted, were still tidy, but they no longer looked as if they were standing for military inspection. The best-kept station competition was never mentioned again. Vera Pickles reported to her clientele that the station master was back on current scones, a sure sign, she declared, that the madness had passed. The vanishing train of Windermere station, which had briefly promised to become a local legend, faded with surprising speed from public conversation. The 4:17 to Oxenholme now ran with monotonous punctuality, its existence no longer a matter for debate, and the town, having been denied a satisfyingly dramatic conclusion, moved on to a more compelling scandal involving the misappropriation of funds for the town's hanging baskets. Major Blenkinsop declared that a bit of discipline had clearly been instilled, and Miss Trimble was able to take tea with her sister in Staveley without any further metaphysical disruptions. They were satisfied, and in their satisfaction, they required no explanation. In his office, Inspector Purbright read the final, formal report on the matter, a document of breathtaking blandness drafted by Sergeant Love and approved by the Chief Constable. It spoke of a series of unfortunate scheduling miscommunications and an isolated instance of equipment malfunction, now rectified. The complex, painful human drama of pride, jealousy, and revenge had been expertly translated into the soothing, impersonal language of bureaucracy. The truth had not been suppressed. It had simply been filed away under miscellaneous, Purbright signed the report at the bottom, blotted the ink, and closed the file. He handed it to Sergeant Love, who placed it into a filing cabinet with a solid, metallic thud. The case was officially closed. The inspector sat at his desk and looked at the pile of paperwork in his in-tray. The top item was a file he had been forced to set aside over a week ago. He pulled it towards him. It was a report concerning the theft of 3 concrete gnomes from the garden of a Mrs. Pringle on the far side of town. He picked up his pen, a faint, weary smile on his lips. The great, absurd dramas came and went, but the small, persistent business of life, in all its quiet foolishness, was eternal.